In 1984, a 12-year-old choirboy named Michael Avery was found in the choir loft of St. Brigid's Chapel, drawing in every hymnal he could find. The drawings were not of saints, not of angels. They were diagrams of people being split apart, with mouths that didn't close and prayers that didn't end. For 3 days, he screamed when anyone touched him, and no one ever understood why, until now. Its stone walls are pale, cracked, and buckling under years of frost. A winter wind moves through the grass like water, bending the yellowed stalks, making them whisper. The door hangs slightly open. It creaks when the wind shifts. Each movement sounds deliberate, as though something were inside, pulling at the hinges, inviting someone closer. St. Brigid's Chapel had been closed for almost 40 years, boarded up, left to rot. The congregation dissolved long ago, most of them leaving the county, some quietly passing away. There were no priests here, no caretakers. And yet, when locals finally forced the doors open again, they didn't find the silence they expected. The air smelled faintly of wax and iron cold, but not stale, like the place had been ventilated, like someone had been breathing here. And on the altar, sitting in a pool of pale light leaking from a cracked window, was a hymnal. It was the only book left in the entire building. Every other one had been removed when the diocese cleared the property decades earlier. This one had no dust on it, no mold. The leather was supple, as though it had only just been bound. And it was open, not to a song, not to a prayer, but to a blank page. The paper wasn't really blank, though. It was filled, edge to edge, with ink. Not writing, drawings, childlike drawings, thick, uneven strokes, circles for heads, jagged lines for limbs. Dozens of little figures, all standing in rows, some kneeling, some lying down, some without faces. The ink was wet enough to smear, and no one could explain why the first to see it was Anthony Kearns, a retired electrician who had lived his entire life 3 miles from the chapel. He said he came up that morning because he'd heard kids had broken in, and he wanted to board the place before the county did. When he stepped inside, he noticed something else. The floor was swept, not clean. There was still dust, still debris, but there were streaks where someone had dragged their feet through it. 2 tracks, side by side, leading from the doorway to the altar, and stopping there. The tracks didn't turn around. There were no other prints, just 2 shallow impressions in the dust, standing right in front of the hymnal, as though whoever made them had been reading. Anthony didn't touch the book. He didn't want to. He said the drawings made him feel hollow behind the ribs, like he was looking at something he shouldn't, even though it was just ink on paper. But when he went back outside and brought 2 neighbors in to see it, the drawings were different. There were more of them, not many, maybe 6 or 7 new figures added to the page, smaller than the others, all drawn kneeling. Their hands were long, reaching up past their own heads, and the ink, still wet. The neighbors swore Anthony had done it, maybe to scare them, maybe to make a story for the papers. But Anthony didn't even own a pen anymore. He lived alone. He was shaking when they found him on the chapel steps, his boots still covered in the chapel's gray dust. He kept saying the same thing over and over to anyone who would listen. The windows are warm. No one knew what that meant. Not yet. The time the sheriff's office arrived that afternoon, word had spread. A small crowd had gathered outside, standing in the weeds, murmuring. No one wanted to step inside, not even the sheriff. At first, he said he could hear something faint from within the chapel. Not voices, not exactly, just a pattern like breathing, or the sound of something heavy, shifting back and forth on old wood. Took them nearly half an hour to work up the courage to check the altar. When they did, the hymnal was still open, but this time, the drawings weren't of people. They were of windows. The page was filled with crude rectangles, each one shaded black, except for a few white streaks that looked like beams of light cutting across the page. And in the center of each rectangle, a small circle, a single eye, dozens of them, each one staring outward. The sheriff flipped back through the book, looking for the original hymns, for anything familiar. Every single page was blank. Every single page. except the one that had been open on the altar, and when he touched the ink, it left a smear across his fingertips. Still fresh, they closed the chapel again that night, nailed the doors shut, told the locals to stay away, but no one slept easy because, when the sun set, people in the valley could see something impossible through the chapel's cracked, soot-dark windows. There was light, a pale, shifting glow, like someone was moving a lantern through the nave, even though no one was inside, and when they drove up the hill to look for themselves, the glow vanished the moment their headlights touched the door. The chapel stood dark, as empty as before still. The light kept returning each night and each morning. Those who dared to look through the cracks swore they could see the hymnal still sitting there, open, as though waiting for someone to turn the page for weeks. No one went back inside, not until Father Mallory came. He was 72 by then, the last priest assigned to St. Brigid's before it shut down. He told people he had a right to see what was left, that the book, whatever it was, might belong to the diocese. He didn't ask for company. He went up alone. The neighbors who watched him walk through the grass said he looked steady, calm, but when he reached the door and placed his hand on the wood, he froze. For almost a full minute, he stood there, perfectly still, like he was listening to something on the other side, and then he pushed it open. The sound carried all the way down the hill, that long, strained creak, like the wood itself was groaning. They didn't see him again for nearly 3 hours, and when he finally stepped back outside, his face was pale, his eyes unfocused. He didn't look at anyone, didn't speak. He just started walking down the hill, through the grass, past the onlookers, all the way to his car. He drove himself home, and by the next morning, he was gone. Not missing, not dead, just gone. His house was empty. His phone left on the kitchen counter, still charging. No note, no trace, and inside the chapel, the hymnal was still there, still open only now. The drawings had changed again. The page was nearly black with ink, as though someone had taken a thick brush and painted over it entirely. But if you tilted your head, if you let your eyes adjust, you could see something faint beneath the layers of black-a shape. Not a person, not a window, but something that looked almost like a mouth. Wide circular teeth drawn in jagged lines, radiating outward, and near the very bottom corner, where the ink was thinnest, a set of initials. FN. The sheriff ordered the book removed. He didn't want it in the chapel anymore, didn't want the locals coming up to gawk at it. But when his deputies came back with a plastic evidence bag, the hymnal was gone. The altar was. Where only the streaks in the dust remained 2 parallel tracks, leading away from the altar, this time toward the door and stopping just shy of the threshold, as though whoever or whatever had carried the book away had vanished before reaching the outside today. The chapel is locked again. The county posted warning signs. No trespassing, unsafe structure. But those who live nearby still swear they see it on the coldest nights, when the wind moves just right. The windows glow, a faint, pale light flickering almost like a lantern, swinging gently back and forth. And sometimes, if you get close enough, you can hear something faint carried on the wind. Not voices, not music, just the soft sound of a page turning. The camera glides down the narrow aisle of St. Brigid's Chapel. Its wooden pews stand crooked, uneven, some splintered from years of neglect. A thin veil of morning light slips through. The high windows, catching dust in slow, weightless spirals. The air feels heavy, even in memory, as though the place holds its breath when you speak of it. This was where Michael Avery spent nearly every Sunday of his short life. He was 14, then tall for his age, with a face still soft from boyhood, quiet, reserved, known, mostly for standing a little apart from the other altar boys, his hands clasped tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words came out slow, as though he were weighing every syllable, carefully, almost fearfully. The congregation liked him. They said he was devout, polite, but no one really knew him. Not even the other boys, not even Father Mallory, who had baptized him himself that morning, the last Sunday he ever served. The first thing people noticed was how still he was. Even before Mass began, Michael knelt at the altar steps, his head slightly bowed, his hands folded. He didn't move, not when people whispered his name, not when the organist rehearsed, not even when Father Mallory touched his shoulder to ask if he was all right. He simply nodded once and stayed where he was. The service began as it always had: the bells, the soft shuffle of feet, the organ swelling to fill the cavernous space. The choir took its place. The first hymn started, but something wasn't right. Those in the pews said it took a moment to notice at first. It was subtle, just a note, maybe two, that hung too long in the air. But soon, the melody began to shift. It grew darker, heavier, not louder, but low, pulling at the room, as though the music were bending under its own weight. None of it was written. The organist swore she hadn't played those notes. The choir director, years later, said it felt like someone else was turning the pages of the score, adding lines no one had rehearsed. And through it all, Michael didn't blink. Not once. Not when the hymn dragged into silence. Not when the congregation turned to look at the loft. Confused, waiting for someone to stop, he just stared at the crucifix above the altar, his lips slightly parted, as though he were listening for something no one else could hear. Father Mallory continued the Mass, his voice steady despite the unease creeping through the room. But during the second reading, something happened that would be repeated by almost a dozen witnesses later. Michael turned his head toward the lectern, slowly, deliberately, and began to mouth the words before they were read aloud. At first, people thought he had simply memorized the passage. He was known to study the Missal on his own. But then, the words changed. The lector's voice trembled. She said she felt as though the lines she had practiced all week had simply vanished. The page in front of her seemed blank, the ink faint, as though the letters had sunk into the paper. Still, read she had to, but the words that left her mouth were not the ones she remembered. They were softer, slower, full of gaps, as though she were pausing to let something else speak between her breaths. And Michael mouthed every one of them, word for word. By the end, no one could repeat what had been said. They could only recall fragments, a reference to the walls that listen, a line about bread that does not feed, but waits, and a phrase that one parishioner, years later, claimed kept him awake for weeks. Those who kneel will not rise, but they will be seen. Father Mallory tried to calm the room, telling the congregation to sit, to pray quietly while he consulted the lector. But even he admitted, privately, that the reading had not been in any version of Scripture. He knew. When the offertory hymn began, the choir faltered again. Their voices dropped to a near whisper, not from fear, but from something else, like they were trying to follow a melody that wasn't on the page. A thin harmony rose between their notes, high, unsteady, almost childish. No one could see where it came from, but several people swore they felt it. Not heard, felt a vibration, faint but present, threading through the wooden floor, traveling up their legs, into their ribs. And still, Michael knelt, his eyes wide, unblinking, locked on the altar, as though his life depended on it. The first person to panic was Ellen Briggs, a mother of 3 sitting near the back. She told her husband she felt wrong in the head, as though the air itself had become too dense to breathe. She stood to leave, but her legs gave out beneath her. She hit the aisle hard, knocking her head against the pew. The sound broke the room. The choir fell silent. The organist's hands froze on the keys, and every head turned toward Michael, because for the first time in the entire Mass, he moved. He raised his chin slowly and turned his head toward Ellen. Witnesses described the same thing, his mouth open slightly, as though he were about to speak. But no sound came, only a faint wheeze, like breath pushing through a throat too dry to carry words. Father Mallory rushed to his side, pulling him gently to his feet, guiding him behind the altar. The boy didn't resist, didn't speak. He simply followed, his eyes never leaving Ellen, who was now sobbing softly into her husband's coat. What happened behind the altar is not fully known. Only Father Mallory and one other altar boy, Thomas Keller, were there, both would later describe the same moment Michael turned to the sacristy door, paused, and whispered something neither of them could understand. Not English, not Latin. The syllables were soft, broken, and strangely rhythmic, like something sung under one's breath. Then he stopped, his body stiffened, and his eyes closed for the first time all morning. He blinked, but he didn't open them again. Not as he was led outside, not as Father Mallory placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered a prayer, not even when the ambulance arrived, when the paramedics checked him. He was breathing pulse normal, but he didn't respond to their voices, didn't react when they touched his arm, his neck, and when they lifted him onto the stretcher. One of them noticed something strange. His eyelids were moving, twitching rapidly, not like a dream, faster, deliberate, almost as if his eyes were scanning something behind them. He was taken to St. Agnes Hospital, 2 towns over, placed under observation. The doctor said he showed no signs of seizure, no head trauma, no infection, but his eyes never opened. Not for 2 days, not until the 3rd night, when the nurse on duty stepped into his room and found him sitting upright in bed. She said he was humming softly, a melody she didn't recognize. Each note held too long, as though he were trying to match something she couldn't hear. When she asked if he was all right, he tilted his head toward her, his eyes still closed, and whispered a single word: wrong. By the time she called for help, he had stopped humming. He lay back down, and by morning, Michael Avery was gone, not dead, not discharged, gone. The window in his room was open, the blinds swaying gently. Though the night had been calm, no one saw him leave. No one saw him again. Only thing left behind was the faint hum of that melody, still clinging to the air of the empty room. And on the bedsheet, near where his head had rested, a single barely visible stain, not blood, not ink, just a thin, gray smear like dust, drawn into the faint outline of a circle. The camera drifts through the dim interior of St. Brigid's Chapel. The boards beneath the pews creak softly, even though no one is walking on them. The morning light, faint and cold, filters through cracked windows and catches on the edges of the altar, illuminating the dust as it swirls in lazy spirals through the air. The hymnal is still there, left open, the leather edges resting flat on the wood, as though it had been placed with care. The pages, though, look different now. The faint drawings that once seemed scattered are no longer faint. Each margin, each white space along the pages is covered in ink, dark, heavy strokes. The lines are jagged, restless. There are no words at first, only figures, dozens of them, each one drawn kneeling, their heads bowed low, but where their mouths should be, there are thin, sharp lines, stitched like little scars, each mouth closed, crossed over with a row of rough, uneven X marks. Their arms are long, stretched, some with fingers that claw the floor, some with no fingers at all, and the pews behind them aren't pews, not anymore. The drawings twist the wooden benches into strange, concentric circles, not stacked, not spiraled, just warped, bent inward, as if the wood itself had softened and curved like something alive. The circles converge on the pulpit, which is no longer solid, in the sketches instead. It bleeds, not literally, not ink dripping from the page, but the way it is drawn, the shadows seem to spill down from it, thick, dark streaks that run like liquid pooling at the base, seeping into the spaces between the kneeling figures and across the top margin. In handwriting so repetitive, it almost becomes a texture of its own. One phrase is written again and again. He doesn't end the song, each word stacked on itself. The letters pressed so hard into the page that the strokes cut faint grooves into the paper. Some of the phrases run sideways along the edges, some upside down. One stretches across a scene, bleeding into 2 separate pages, like the writer couldn't stop moving their hand, even to turn the book. The ink is still damp, not enough to drip, just enough to smudge if touched. That's what unsettled the sheriff most. When he first saw it, Sheriff Reed had been on the force for 25 years. He was a careful man, deliberate, known for his calm even in the worst calls. He didn't scare easily, but when he saw the hymnal on the altar, saw what had been drawn inside it. He didn't touch it, didn't even get closer than a few feet. He just stared, and when one of his deputies asked if they should bag it, Reed shook his head. Not yet. He said, "Look at the ink. Someone's been here today." They searched the chapel, every corner, every stairwell, the broken sacristy where the old robes had been stored, but there were no footprints, no new tracks in the dust, only the same. 2 shallow impressions leading to the altar and back toward the door, stopping at the threshold where they always stopped, and when Reed finally did pick up the hymnal, holding it carefully by its edges, he realized something he hadn't noticed before. The pages weren't uniform. Some were thicker than others, layered, as though multiple sheets had been glued together in places, and when he tilted the book toward the light, faint impressions showed through the stacked paper shapes, pressed deep into the layers, circles long. Uneven scratches. He closed it, and for a moment, the chapel went completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to still. That's when he heard a sound from somewhere above. Not footsteps, not the settling of old wood. It was faint, almost a vibration, a low hum rising and falling, the way a song might sound if it were buried beneath layers of earth-reed froze. Staring up toward the loft, the stairs had collapsed years ago. No one could reach it anymore. And yet, the hum persisted. Not loud, just there one of his deputies whispered his name, motioning toward the window. The glass was fogging, not from cold. The day was mild, but from the inside, as though the air in the chapel had shifted. Warmer now, heavy with moisture. They left quickly, locked the doors, nailed them shut again, but Reed didn't take the hymnal with him. He set it back on the altar, open, the ink still wet, and told his men they'd return in daylight with gloves, masks, and evidence bags. They didn't that night. Reed went home. He lived alone, on the far edge of town. Neighbors later said they heard something strange coming from his house around midnight. Not shouting, not music, a sound low, drawn out, like someone humming through clenched teeth, pausing every few seconds, then starting again. When deputies arrived the next morning, the house was empty. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, but on the kitchen table, they found a torn sheet of paper, not from the hymnal, just ordinary notebook paper. On it were the same drawings, figures kneeling, mouths sewn shut, pews bending inward, and the pulpit bleeding shadows in the bottom corner, scrawled so deep it cut through the paper and into the wood beneath. The same phrase repeated over and over. He doesn't end the song. The deputies didn't stay long. One said the walls felt like they were vibrating, though no machinery ran nearby. Another swore he heard a faint whistle, high-pitched, coming from the ceiling. Though there were no vents, they took the paper, locked the house, and left. In that evening, when they drove past St. Brigid's again, the windows of the chapel glowed faintly. Not a steady light, but a pulse, a soft, rhythmic flicker, as though something inside were moving in time with that. Low, distant hum. The hymnal was still inside, still open, the ink on its pages, somehow, impossibly, still wet, and as one deputy swore later, though he admitted he might have imagined it, might have been too tired, too strung out to trust what he saw. He thought he saw the edges of the pages moving, not turning, not being lifted by the wind, just trembling, as though the book itself were listening and waiting for something to end, something that hadn't yet, something that maybe couldn't. Camera lingers on a narrow corridor of gray stone. The walls of St. Brigid's rectory are damp, discolored by years of leaking pipes, and lit only by the faint yellow glow of a single bulb. The light hums softly, flickering just enough to make the shadows breathe along the corners. At the end of the hall, there is a wooden door. Its paint is peeling. Its hinges sag under their own weight. Behind it, Father Loren kept his quarters and his journal. The room, when seen now, is almost bare, an iron-framed bed, a wooden desk with deep scratches on its surface, and, in the corner, a narrow window that never fully closed, allowing the wind to slip through in slow, rhythmic sighs. This was where he wrote down what he could not bring himself to say aloud. Father Loren was the assistant priest at St. Brigid's. younger than Mallory by nearly 3 decades. With a soft voice and careful manner, parishioners remembered him for his calm, for the way he lingered with the sick and grieving after Mass, sometimes long past dark. But in the months after Michael, Avery was brought into the rectory after that final Mass. When the boy still hadn't spoken, those who saw Lauren noticed a change. He looked thinner. The skin beneath his eyes turned gray, sagging like melted wax. He avoided the others, even Mallory, and when people asked what troubled him, he only said, "I'm listening." No one knew what he meant. Not then. It was only after he left the priesthood, resigning without warning, vanishing into a quiet life 2 states away, that his journals were found, 3 of them, bound in cracked leather, tucked behind a false back in his desk drawer. The pages, yellowed and brittle, record the days and nights he spent watching Michael, and the things he could not understand. He wrote about the boy's stillness, how Michael would sit on the edge of his bed for hours, staring at the wall across from him, how he would tilt his head slightly, as if trying to hear a whisper just beneath, the hum of the rectory's pipes, and how, when the wind died and the building went quiet, the scratching would start at first. Lauren thought it was mice, but the sound wasn't random. It was measured steady, like a pen moving across paper, except Michael didn't hold one. His hands always rested in his lap, motionless still. The marks would appear. Lauren described the first night clearly. He had dozed off in the chair beside Michael's bed, the candle beside him burning low. When he woke, the boy hadn't moved, but the wall, the plaster directly in front of him, was covered in faint, dark strokes, thin lines, intersections, shapes that almost resembled letters, but not in any language Lauren recognized. And when he looked down at the floor, he saw the same lines there, carved into the wood with something sharp. They hadn't been there when he'd closed his eyes. Michael was still staring, his lips moving, not making sound, just shaping words that never reached the air. And that's when Lauren noticed something worse. The strokes on the wall were still being drawn. The lines extended, 1 slow inch at a time, as though an invisible hand were guiding them, each one emerging directly in front of Michael's vacant eyes, and his lips kept moving. Lauren tried to speak to him. He whispered Michael's name, asked if he could hear him, if he knew what he was doing. The boy didn't react. His breathing didn't change. He didn't blink, but the lines kept forming. The priest backed away slowly, blowing out the candle, hoping the dark might stop it. It didn't. In the faint light of the hallway, he could still see the shapes etching themselves into the plaster. The sound, so faint before, seemed louder now, the soft, rhythmic scrape of something sharp, not frantic, not hurried, just steady, deliberate. He left the room that night and prayed until morning, but when he returned, Michael was still sitting there, the wall behind him now nearly black with strokes, layered and tangled, as if the marks had been drawn, erased, and drawn again. And on the desk beside the bed, where no one had placed it, sat a single page from a hymnal, torn at the edges, blank, except for a faint gray circle drawn in the center. The ink, as always, was still wet over the following weeks. Laurent's journal entries grew shorter, more desperate. His handwriting became jagged, harder to read, as though written in haste or with an unsteady hand. He stopped noting the date on most pages, instead marking only the hour, always between midnight and 4 in the morning. When the house was silent, except for the wind, he wrote that the drawings were no longer confined to the walls. They appeared on the windows, on the glass of picture, frames, even on the surface of the holy water font by the door, faint and swirling, as though traced by a fingertip. He would wipe them away, but by nightfall they would return, and Michael had stopped eating. He no longer reacted to food or water, to light or touch, but each night, without fail, his lips would move for hours, silent, endless, shaping words no one else could hear. Lauren recorded one moment in detail that he never spoke, of a loud one that seemed to fracture something in him. He had been kneeling beside the bed, whispering a prayer as Michael stared past him. The candle between them flickered violently, though there was no draft, and then it went out. The room was silent, completely still until Lauren heard a sound. Not Michael's breathing, not the wind through the cracked window-way voice, faint behind him, so soft he almost thought it was the house settling. But it wasn't coming from the hall. It was coming from the plaster wall, where the shapes had been scratched again and again. He turned his head, just enough to see them in the darkness. The lines had shifted, curved, bent into something almost like an open mouth, and from that dark curve, that jagged shape, came the whisper, "Keep watching." He left the room, didn't return until sunrise. His final entries, written over the course of 2 nights, are nearly illegible. The words are broken, repetitive lines of scripture scrawled, and crossed-out phrases repeated in the margins, stacked on top of one another until the ink bled through the page. One of those phrases appeared more than a dozen times, pressed so deep it tore the paper. He's still drawing. The last page of the final journal contains only 4 words, written in the center in a trembling hand. "I can't keep watching." Father Lauren resigned the next morning. He didn't give notice. He didn't attend Mass. He simply packed his things, left his collar on the desk, and drove away before anyone else woke. Michael Avery was moved from the rectory that same day. No one knows why the diocese never said. In the weeks that followed, those who stayed behind said the lines on the rectory walls began to fade slowly, unevenly, until nothing remained. But even now, when the wind cuts through the cracks in that old building just right, neighbors swear they can hear something faint from the room at the end of the hall. Not voices, not prayer, just the soft, steady scrape of a pen and the whisper of lips moving, shaping words that never make a sound. The camera drifts through the nave of St. Brigid's Chapel. The light is dim, filtered through narrow windows streaked with years of grime, turning everything a muted gray dust. Lingers in the air, unsettled, moving in slow spirals, as if disturbed by something unseen. The pews are empty, but the faint smell of wax and wood polish lingers, as though the space was recently occupied. And near the loft, the faint echo of a note, a low, droning hum, holding steady long after any hands left the keys. This was the night the choir stopped breathing. It began as routine, a Tuesday evening rehearsal. 16 voices spread across the pews and the loft, practicing hymns for the coming Sunday. The building was cold, as it always was in February. Breath hung faintly in the air when they sang. The organist, Margaret Hensley, was the first to notice something strange. It wasn't a sound. Not at first. It was the way the air seemed to shift. Just before the 3rd hymn, like the room had grown heavier, thicker. Every exhale felt slower, denser still. The choir began as scheduled. They opened their mouths. They took one collective, practiced breath. But this one did not end. They inhaled and held it. Margaret thought they were joking at first. A prank, perhaps to shake off the stiffness of the cold night. But the faces around her told her otherwise. Each singer stood frozen, their chests expanded, shoulders rigid, their mouths still slightly open, as though mid-note, but no sound came. Their eyes didn't close, didn't blink. The pupils looked glassy, unfocused, as though they were staring at something far beyond the chapel walls. And the seconds passed 30, 60, 90. Not one of them moved. Margaret called out, her voice echoing sharply in the silence. No one responded. She reached for the nearest soprano, placing a hand on her arm. The skin felt cold, taut, as though every muscle beneath had locked in place. And then she realized something else. None of them were breathing out. No soft hiss of exhalation, no twitch of the lips or nose. Their lungs remained full. Distended. The faint fog of breath that had lingered in the air before was gone. Margaret stumbled back toward the organ, calling for help, but no one outside could hear her. The chapel doors, though unlocked, refused to budge when she tried. And that's when the organ played single note, low, drawn out, resonating through the hollow wooden space like the groan of something buried beneath the floor. Margaret's hands were nowhere near the keys. No one else was seated at the bench. Still, the sound persisted. It didn't waver. It didn't end. It held steady. For as long as the choir stood frozen in their breath, The sound filled the chapel so completely that Margaret said she could feel it in her bones. It wasn't loud, but it carried a vibration more than a tone, rattling faintly in the wooden pews and the glass of the high windows. And then, slowly, a second sound joined it, not a note, not a melody, just a faint, rhythmic thump like a heartbeat far away, deep beneath the floorboards. Two sounds pulsed together. For 6 full minutes Margaret said she felt her own breath shorten, not because she wanted to hold it, because it felt. Stolen, each inhale grew shallow, harder to draw, as though the air itself resisted her lungs. Her vision blurred at the edges. Her hands trembled against the cold ivory keys of the organ, and the choir still didn't move. 16 bodies, perfectly still, their faces fixed forward, lips parted, chests unmoving. Some had tears forming in the corners of their eyes, streaking slowly down their cheeks, but none blinked. None looked away. Margaret thought she might pass out. She turned toward the nearest window, hoping to smash it for air, but her legs wouldn't move. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor beside the organ bench, gasping shallowly against the boards. That's when it stopped. The note cut off. The pulse beneath the floor went silent, and in perfect unison, all 16 choir members collapsed. Some crumpled forward over the pews. Others slid sideways to the floor, their bodies limp, their faces pale and damp with tears. Margaret crawled toward the nearest one, pressing her ear against a chest. A heartbeat shallow but present, she called their names, shook their shoulders. No response. Each of them remained unconscious. For nearly 5 minutes, when they woke, they were disoriented, glassy-eyed, unable to stand. Some wept without knowing why, others gagged, clutching at their throats, as though their lungs still couldn't fill. Not one of them remembered what happened. Not the note, not the stillness, not the 6 minutes without air only. Margaret remembered, and she refused to step foot in St. Brigid's. Again later, when the deputies arrived, the organ was still warm, its wood faintly humming, as though a note had just been played, but no one had touched it. There were no footprints near the bench, no marks on the keys. One deputy leaned close, pressing his ear to the wood, and swore he could hear something. Not music, not humming, a faint, steady scrape like a pencil dragging across paper. Somewhere deep inside the body of the instrument. He backed away, quickly refused to inspect it further. The choir never rehearsed there again. Mass was moved to the parish hall. The chapel doors were sealed a second time, nailed shut, but locals still talk about that night. The strange pulse, the note that played without hands, and the 16 voices, silent all at once, their lungs filled with a breath that refused to leave. Some say that, on certain winter nights, if you stand outside the chapel long enough, you can still hear it, a single low note, faint but present, carried on the wind and beneath it. A soft, uneven breath, rising, holding, waiting for something that hasn't yet exhaled. The camera moves slowly along the length of St. Brigid's Chapel, its wooden beams groan faintly in the wind. A sound too low to be heard clearly, more felt than anything else. The light through the high windows is thin, fractured by years of grime and cracks in the glass, stretching shadows across the stone walls at the far end. Behind the altar, the wall rises in a cold, gray sheet of limestone. No door, no seams, just unbroken stone. But one of the drawings said otherwise. It had been torn from the hymnal, the same one that had been found weeks earlier. Its pages wet with fresh ink. This page was different. No kneeling figures, no bleeding pulpit, just a crude, black outline of a door, drawn directly behind the altar, where no door had ever been, and along the bottom edge of the drawing, in a childlike scrawl, 5 words were pressed so hard into the paper that they tore through it. Don't look where it ends. Father Lorne found the drawing late one evening, tucked between the pages of his journal, without explanation. He didn't write it. He didn't see anyone leave it. But when he ran his thumb along the paper, the ink smeared, faintly damp, as though it had been drawn only moments before. He tried to dismiss it. A prank, another in a long string of strange disruptions that had plagued the rectory and chapel since Michael Avery's last service. But that night, When the wind cut through the cracked windows of the rectory, he heard it again, a scratching faint rhythmic coming from somewhere beneath the chapel floor, tracing a line along the stone as though someone or something was marking the walls. The sound stopped only when he turned toward the altar, toward the place the drawing had marked. The next morning, he brought 2 men with him, Thomas Keller, the older of the altar boys, now 16, and a maintenance worker from town, Glenn Howell, who had been hired by the parishiers before to repair the chapel roof. The 3 of them arrived just after sunrise. The doors of the chapel creaked as they opened, the hinges leaving faint orange streaks of rust on their frames. Inside, the air felt stale cooler than the day outside and faintly damp, as though the stones still held the chill of winter Lauren, showed them the drawing. Neither man laughed. Thomas, pale and silent, only nodded. Glenn muttered something under his breath, something about kids breaking in, though his voice wavered together. They moved behind the altar. The limestone wall stood flat and featureless, its surface worn smooth by decades of smoke and candle soot. But when Glenn pressed his palm against it, he felt something strange, a vibration, faint but steady, like the hum of machinery somewhere deep within the stone. And then he noticed a line. It wasn't obvious at first, not a gap, not even a crack, just a faint seam, running vertically along the center of the wall, thin enough that dust and soot had settled into it, almost hiding it completely. Glenn traced it with his finger. It was cold, colder than the rest of the wall, and when Thomas leaned closer, tilting his head, he swore he could hear something, not the vibration Glenn felt, not the hum, something elsey, uneven sound like breathing, slow and deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was on the other side was matching their silence. Stepped back quickly and said nothing. Lauren retrieved the old crowbar kept in the sacristy, the same one used to pry loose warped floorboards and stubborn window frames. When he slid it into the seam and applied pressure, the stone didn't resist. It moved not all at once, not like a door on a hinge. The wall shifted inch by inch, as though something behind it gave way reluctantly. The sound it made was deep, groaning, almost organic, and as the opening widened, the air that seeped out carried a smell none of them recognized. Not rot, not mold, something dry, stale, like dust sealed for too long, but beneath it, a faint metallic tang, sharp enough to make their throats tighten. They opened it just wide enough to slip through. What lay beyond was not a room, at least, not one they could measure. Their lantern light barely touched the walls. The space seemed to stretch farther than it should have, yet when they stepped inside, their footsteps echoed strangely delayed, softened, as though the sound had to travel somewhere else before returning to their ears. The floor was stone, uneven and cracked, but the walls looked wrong. They weren't cut like the chapel stone. They weren't even uniform. They were layered, slabs upon slabs, stacked haphazardly, as though the passage had been assembled from scraps of older structures. Some pieces bore faint markings, scratches, carvings, worn symbols that had long since eroded into meaningless grooves, and the deeper they stepped, the colder the air became. Their breath turned visible, hanging in front of their faces in long, trembling wisps. That's when Glenn spoke. He said it felt like the passage was leaning, not the floor, the air, as though something was pulling him forward, subtly, gently, the way a draft tugs at a loose door. He planted his feet, gripping the lantern tighter, but his hand shook, the light flickering across the uneven walls. Thomas said nothing. He was staring ahead, past the reach of the light, toward where the stone vanished into a soft, velvety darkness. And that's when he heard a sound from ahead, not breathing, not the low hum they'd felt in the wall, a single, faint scrape like a pen against paper drawn slowly, deliberately. The same sound Father Lauren had heard at night. Beneath the rectory floor, the 3 of them froze. The sound came again, softer this time, farther, but not by much. Lauren whispered for them to turn back. Neither moved. The air felt heavier now. Each inhale slow and strained, as though they were drawing it through water. Glenn lowered the lantern, angling it toward the floor, and that's when they saw it, a line thin, straight, running along the cracks in the stone floor drawn in a dark, gray residue, faintly reflective in the lantern light. It led deeper, vanishing into the dark ahead, and with each second, they realized something that made their skin crawl. The line was fresh, still wet, still glistening, as though whatever was drawing it had just passed. Thomas took a step back. His heel struck something solid, the wall behind them. Except it wasn't the same wall they had entered through when they turned. The seam was gone. The stone behind them was unbroken, smooth, cold to the touch. The lantern light dimmed, sputtering as the air grew colder. Glenn muttered a prayer. His breath shaking in pale clouds, Lauren gripped his arm, pulling him close, whispering for him not to speak, because from somewhere ahead, just beyond the edge of the light, came a new sound. Not the scrape, not the hum, not the breath, a voice, low, faint, repeating a single word, drawn out, measured, closer. The lantern flickered once, twice, and went out in the blackness. The scrape began again, louder this time, moving toward them. A camera drifts through the nave of St. Brigid's Chapel. The light is dim. The shadows stretched long and soft by the flickering glow of the candles still scattered along the walls. Every sound, the faint creak of the wooden beams, the soft hiss of wind slipping through the cracks, seems distant, like it's being swallowed before it can settle. The air feels warm, but every breath hangs pale and visible, trembling just inches. From the lips before vanishing into nothing, and from somewhere deep in the building, past the altar, past the darkened passage no one admits to walking, comes a sound, a song, faint, layered, but wrong. Each note moves in reverse, as though someone is unspooling a hymn, one breath at a time, pulling the melody backward into itself. It isn't loud, it isn't hurried, but the sound travels through the stones, trembling along the windows and pews, until it feels as though the entire chapel is humming in reverse. And that's when they saw it. There were 4 witnesses that night, all locals, none of them inside the chapel itself. Each had stopped along the road outside when they noticed the light, the faint, rhythmic flicker of the candles through the stained glass, as though someone had lit them one by one, despite the chapel being sealed for weeks at first. They thought it was vandals, teenagers breaking in to light candles and scare each other. But then the sound came, that backward hymn in the glow of the high windows. Their breath turned white, drifting in the air despite the warmth of the evening. 4 of them stood frozen at the gate. No one spoke, no one moved closer. Each said later that it felt as though the air itself had thickened, pulling their lungs tighter with every inhale. And then something moved at first. They thought it was a shadow, a flicker cast by the flames, but the shape didn't sway with the light. It crawled across the ceiling of the chapel, not the floor. Never touching it, it moved with a slow, deliberate motion, limbs bent at unnatural angles, fingers pressed flat to the stone above, as though it were weightless. Its body was long, too long, stretching and contracting in ways that made it hard to tell where one limb ended and another began. No one saw a face. No one could tell if it even had one, but wherever it moved, it left something behind, pages torn from the old hymnals, each one drifting down slowly, as though suspended in water, turning end over end in the warm, heavy air. Not a sound as they touched the floor, just a faint, dry whisper as they settled into the aisles and along the altar step. The witnesses swore the pages weren't blank, even from outside. Through the faint, dirty glass, they could see the black marks, figures, symbols drawn so dark. The ink bled through the paper, leaving faint stains wherever the pages landed, and then the music stopped. The backward hymn cut off mid-note, like a reel of tape snapping the air when still too still. Every witness described the same thing, the feeling that the chapel had emptied of sound entirely, that even their own hearts had paused in their chests. And in that silence, something knocked 3 times from inside the chapel, each one deep, hollow, resonating not through the walls or floor, but through the air itself, as though the sound was striking their bones rather than their ears. The shape on the ceiling stilled, its limbs splayed wide, its body stretched long and flat against the stone, like it had pressed itself into place, and then slowly, The candles began to die, one by one, not from wind, not of air, just gone, each flame snuffed out, as though something invisible passed over it, moving in a wide, deliberate circle around the altar. When the last light vanished, the witnesses said they felt it, not a sound, not a touch, a weight, as though something inside the chapel had leaned forward, just enough to press against their ribs from a distance. One of them, a man named Harold Munn, who had worked maintenance at the chapel years before, finally broke. He shouted, called out to whoever might be inside, demanding they stop, demanding to know what was happening. And that's when he heard it, not the backward hymn, not the knocks, not the pages drifting a whisper right against his ear, close enough that he felt the heat of it, even though no one stood beside him. You opened it. The other three didn't hear the words. They only saw Harold freeze, his face draining of color, as his breath came in short, shallow bursts, clouding pale against the warm air. And then, from inside the chapel, a single sound rose again, the organ playing one note low, drawn out, the same tone the choir had heard weeks earlier, when they'd all stopped breathing at once. But this time, the note wavered, bent, like the pitch was being pulled apart, stretched thinner and thinner, until it was more vibration than music. The shape on the ceiling moved again, not toward the altar, not toward the floor, toward the windows, toward the glass where the witnesses stood frozen. Each of them said the same thing later. They couldn't run, not because they didn't want to, but because their legs felt like they no longer belonged to them. Each step they tried to take felt delayed, disconnected, as though they were moving through something heavy, like water, and then the glass fogged over a single circle drawn from the inside, perfect smooth, its outline smeared slightly, as though pressed by something damp. The four of them stared at it, not moving, not breathing, and behind the fogged glass, a shadow past it. Wasn't the shape on the ceiling. It wasn't human at all. It was too broad, too low to the ground, yet too tall to be crawling. Its edges seemed to blur, as though it weren't moving through the chapel at all, but around it the hymn pages on the floor lifted suddenly, one by one, as though caught in a draft no one could feel. They circled upward, spiraling toward the rafters, catching faint glints of the candle wax as they spun, and then, all at once, every page dropped flat, silent, still. The organ note cut off. The air warmed. The breath vanished, and the chapel was quiet again. The four witnesses ran then. None of them looked back. None of them spoke to each other until they'd reached the edge of Vaugh. Town, miles away. Each swore they'd seen something different in those windows. Some said the shadow had been standing. Others said crawling. One swore it had been looking directly at them, though it had no eyes he could see. But they all agreed on one thing: the circle, the one drawn on the inside of the glass. Each of them swore it was still there when they left, and when they drove back the next morning, the circle remained darker now, as though something had pressed its weight into the pane from the inside, leaving not just fog, but a faint, greasy smear along the glass. And faintly, beneath the surface, letters had begun to form, not written, not etched, just appearing stroke by stroke, one after another, as though someone inside was still tracing the words slowly, carefully, over and over. None of the witnesses stayed long enough to see what the letters spelled. Not one of them has gone near St. Brigid's since, but the circle remains. And some nights, when the wind cuts just right through the valley, the windows glow faintly again, and beneath that backward hymn, faint and layered, a new sound can be heard. Not singing, not words, the soft, steady scrape of a pen end, something just beyond the glass, whispering over and over, not done, not done, not done. The camera lingers on the hospital corridor. Its walls are pale, almost colorless, their surfaces washed in the faint hum of fluorescent lights that flicker just enough to make shadows shiver across. The floor, the air is still cool. Every sound, distant footsteps. The low roll of a gurney wheel seems muffled, as if something is pressing down on the building itself. At the far end, behind a sealed door, Michael Avery was still screaming. He had been screaming for 3 days, 72 hours. No water, no food, No pause to breathe beyond the shallow gasps that broke the noise only long enough to keep him alive. But something wasn't right. Sound was constant, unbroken, not the frantic, panicked kind of scream one expects from pain or fear. It was steady, deliberate, each pitch stretched until it trembled, as if his lungs weren't straining at all, as though his body had become nothing but a vessel for sound. The nurses rotated, in shifts. Most lasted less than 20 minutes outside his room before requesting transfer to another floor. Some said the sound made their teeth ache. Others swore it settled into their skull, a vibration more than a noise, as though something inside their own bones was echoing his pitch, and though every corner of the room was checked, no one could find the source of that resonance. It didn't come from his throat alone. It came from the walls, the floor, the frame of the bed itself. If the building had been taught to hum along with him, doctors tried everything: sedation, restraints. Even mild anesthetics meant to weaken the muscles of his throat. Nothing worked when they examined him. His body showed no signs of strain, no torn tissue, no swelling, no dehydration despite the absence of water. It was as if his body had ceased to require the things that should have been failing first. But his eyes told a different story. The first day, they darted wildly, as though searching for something unseen. The second, they fixed on the ceiling, unblinking glass-like. By the third, they rolled back completely, revealing only pale whites that quivered with each pulse of his scream. Some said it looked less like he was crying out, and more like he was listening. Father Lauren came to see him on the third night. He stood outside the glass, hands clasped tight, his lips moving in prayer that couldn't rise above the sound spilling from Michael's mouth. Witnesses said the priest whispered something. No one could hear the words, but when he finished, he turned away quickly, his face pale, his eyes wet. He refused to enter the room itself, and he didn't return after that night inside. Michael's body began to tremble, not violently, not convulsing, just enough that the metal of the bed frame clicked softly against the floor in rhythm with the rise and fall of his screams. That's when one of the nurses noticed something. His lips weren't moving anymore. The screams still came loud, sharp, unbroken, but his mouth was still slightly open, his jaw slack. The sound no longer matched his breath. It came during inhales, during exhales, even when his chest stopped moving entirely. And somewhere deep in the sound, beneath the pitch itself, a pattern began to emerge. Not words, not music, just a cadence, a strange, pulsing rhythm repeating every few seconds like a chant without language. Monitors around his bed began to flicker. First the heart rate, then the oxygen levels. Each screen trembled, the numbers flashing and distorting as the pitch seemed to settle deeper into the wires and circuits themselves. The doctors shut the machines off. The sound remained on the 72nd hour. The scream stopped, not gradually, not fading. It ended mid-pitch, the way a dropped needle lifts from a record. The room fell silent. The hum in the walls ceased. The bed frame stilled for the first time in 3 days. The air felt thin and breathable again. The nurses exhaled. One began to cry quietly in relief. But Michael Avery wasn't breathing. His chest didn't rise. No faint fog of breath formed in the cool hospital air. And when they checked his pulse, nothing moved beneath his skin. But something wasn't right. There was no strain in his throat, no bruising, no trauma to the vocal cords despite 72 hours of impossible sound. His body showed no signs of dehydration or organ failure. It was as if his body had been paused in time. The moment the sound ceased, the only thing they found was his face, his jaw still hung open, his lips slightly parted, and if anyone leaned close enough, they swore they could feel a vibration, faint, steady, not coming from his chest, not from the air, from somewhere deeper, like the echo of his scream had never truly ended. And as one nurse reached to close his mouth, her hand froze because from deep in his throat, soft enough to be felt more than heard, something moved, not a sound, not a word, just a breath. Deliberate drawing inward, the camera drifts slowly through the archive hall. Tall shelves of dark wood stretch upward into the dim light. their edges lined with decades of dust. Each step along the marble floor echoes softly, distant and hollow, as though the sound is being drawn away into the walls themselves. A single lamp burns at the center table. Its circle of light falls on a stack of thin, yellowed folders, their corners frayed and edges brittle from age, stamped across the first one. In faded ink is the word Brigid. The diocese called them routine records, baptisms, donations, attendance logs from decades past. But beneath the layers of forms and signatures, another set of pages had been hidden pages written in a different hand, pages no one was meant to see. They told a different story. One, the official reports never mentioned the church had declared Michael Avery's death a medical tragedy, a sudden and inexplicable failure of his lungs. Despite their repeated insistence that there had been no underlying condition, the coroner's notes, at least the version filed with the county, said his body showed no trauma, no sign of malnutrition, nothing out of the ordinary. But the hidden pages described something else. They said the room where he died smelled of candle soot, not sterile hospital air, not the sharp bite of antiseptic candle soot, thick enough that it left faint black marks along the vents and walls. They said the monitors in his room had continued to flicker for hours after his death, even when unplugged from the wall, each screen flashing faint, distorted symbols, shapes no technician could trace to the hospital systems. The machines were removed and destroyed within the day, but something wasn't right. One report, handwritten, dated the morning after his death, noted that the noise didn't stop immediately. Not the scream, not the hum, but something softer, a faint scratching, like a pen against paper, coming from the hospital walls. The sound continued for nearly 2 hours before finally falling silent. That same day, the diocese issued orders every hymnal from St. Brigid's was to be collected and burned, no exceptions. Even those held in private homes, teams were sent door to door, offering stipends for any that remained. No questions asked. By the end of the week, they had burned over 200 copies in a single night. The fire kept low and hidden behind the chapel's stone wall. The ash was buried beneath the rectory, garden and the choir loft. The place where Michael had first been seen drawing without a pen in his hand was sealed. The documents described the process in exacting detail. Sheets of black iron bolted into the doorframe, welded along the seams, not just to keep people out, but to keep something in. Witnesses from the work crew reported hearing something as they worked. Not voices, not singing, but a steady, low hum, vibrating through the beams as they drilled. One man claimed he could feel it in his jaw, rattling his teeth with every strike of the hammer. He left before the job was finished. Refusing to collect his pay, the others stayed. None of them ever spoke to each other about it again, but all of them, in later years, admitted the same thing to their families. When the last weld was cooled, when the last hammer struck and the loft was sealed, the hum stopped, and for just a moment, the iron sheets grew warm beneath their hands, not hot, not burning, just warm, like something on the other side had exhaled. Diocese knew it couldn't control the rumors. The townspeople already whispered about Michael's screams, about the hymnals and the pages, about the things that had been seen in the chapel at night. So they did what they could. They paid families of the choir members, staff from the hospital, even the workers who had sealed the loft. Each was offered a settlement. Each was made to sign papers stating they would not speak publicly about what had happened inside St. Brigid's. Most agreed. The amounts were modest, but enough to keep them quiet. Those who refused, their names were not in the files, just a single note, written in the margin of one page, handled, and beneath it, in a hand different from the rest, 4 words pressed deep into the paper, so deep they left faint impressions on the page below. They still hear it. There were final pages, tucked into the back of the folder, paper so thin it nearly crumbled to the touch. No date, no author, just short, fragmented sentences, observations, scattered like someone had written them in haste. Breath visible, no cold air. Hymns continue, even when empty. Pages return after burning, something inside still drawing. And at the bottom, Alone, written in a darker ink than the rest. The loft is not empty. Whoever wrote it had underlined the sentence twice and beneath. The second line, a faint smear of gray, as though the ink had been blurred by a fingertip or something wet the file ends there. No conclusion, no signature. Just that final note, followed by a blank page, but on the reverse side of that page, pressed faintly into the fibers of the paper, a single line can still be seen when held to the light, a sentence, etched as though by a pen with no ink, barely visible, but legible. They want the rest. And when the lamp at the archive table is turned off, in the dark, the words seem to rise slightly from the page, not glowing, not burning, just there, as though someone is still tracing them over and over from the other side of the paper. And somewhere in the hall, faintly, the sound begins again, not the hum, not the scrape, a low, distant note, sustained, pulling through the air like a slow inhale, and then softly, almost too quiet to notice. The sound of a page turning. The camera lingers on the old chapel. St. Brigid's sits alone on the hill, its steeple shrouded by a rolling sea of fog. The winter air is heavy. Each breath lingers. Too long, pale and still, before disappearing into the mist. The windows are dark, the roof lines sagging with years of rot and weight, but from somewhere inside, beneath the silence, there is a sound, a hymn, faint, wordless, carried on the wind like something drifting up from the earth itself. It isn't loud, it isn't clear, but every note feels deliberate, measured, the kind of sound that doesn't just reach your ears. It settles into the chest, into the teeth, like it's vibrating through the air, not riding on it. And the locals know, they know to keep walking when the fog comes. Down over St. Brigid's, because if you follow the hymn, you don't always come back. It only happens on certain nights, when the fog is thick enough to erase the road, to make the trees disappear just feet away, when the chapel's silhouette becomes nothing but a darker shape in a wall of shifting gray. That's when the hymn begins. Low at first, just a hum, barely there, the kind of sound that could be mistaken for wind until it holds one note too long. The curious always stop. Some turn back immediately, feeling that quiet rise of dread in their chest. Others step closer, and that's when they see it. The chapel's main doors are locked. They have been for years. Rust lines the hinges. The wood is swollen with decades of moisture, bowed inward, like something has been pressing against it from the inside. But the hymn doesn't come from the doors. It doesn't come from the windows. It comes from behind the altar, and on nights when the fog curls thick through the nave, a door appears there, a seam in the stone, faint and narrow, just wide enough to be noticed if you're looking for it. It isn't on any of the blueprints. It was never part of the original design yet. Those who have seen it all describe the same thing. The stones shift slightly, not outward, not inward, but apart, as if the wall itself is exhaling, and a frame takes shape, a door tall marrow, made of the same black iron that was used to seal the choir loft years before. Something wasn't right. The iron is warm, even in the dead of winter, when frost creeps along the chapel's windows, and the fog bites at the skin. The metal radiates a low, steady heat, and when the hymn swells, that warmth pulses slow, like a heartbeat. The locals say you can knock on it, but no sound comes back, not even the echo of your own hand against the metal. The knock is swallowed, whole, as though the door doesn't lead to space at all, as though it leads to something that can't reflect sound. But every person who's found it agrees on one thing: the handle is always unlocked. It doesn't creak when it moves. It doesn't scrape the floor or catch in the frame. The iron door opens as though it weighs nothing at all, despite the way it sinks deep into the stone when closed. And when it opens, the hymn grows louder, not by much, just enough that you can tell it isn't coming from the chapel anymore. It's coming from beyond the threshold, but no one can describe what's on the other side. Some say it's another hall, lined with wooden pews, the air filled with a faint layer of ash that drifts upward instead of falling. Others say there is no hall at all, just a narrow set of stairs, descending in slow, spiraling turns, The hymn, echoing up from somewhere far below one man, claimed he saw nothing but fog, a thick, endless wall of gray, moving as if something huge was shifting within it. He never returned to check a second time, but every account shares a single detail. Once you step through, the door doesn't close even if you turn back, even if you don't walk more than a few feet past the threshold. The door will not shut. It remains open, no matter how many times you push, no matter how much force you use. And when you leave, when you step back into the chapel's cold air, the hymn stops, the warmth fades, and the iron frame vanishes, leaving nothing but the old stone wall behind. But those who have crossed through swear they can still hear it days later, weeks, always at night, when the air is still and their homes are quiet, a faint, wordless melody, too low for anyone else to notice, humming from somewhere deep within their walls. And some of them swear they still feel that warmth on their hands, the pulse in the iron. One woman who had lived near the chapel all her life said she followed the hymn once just far enough to see the iron door appear in the wall. She didn't open it, didn't touch it. She simply stood and watched as the fog pooled along the altar steps and the scene widened, stone shifting soundlessly to reveal the frame. She turned to leave, her breath trembling in the cold air. But as she stepped back, she heard it, not the hymn, not the hum, a whisper from somewhere behind her, close enough that she felt it move the hair near her ear. Even though she was alone, stay, she ran, didn't look back, didn't speak about it for months. But when she finally told her son what she'd heard, she admitted something worse, that the voice hadn't sounded unfamiliar. It sounded like her own. The locals avoid St. Brigid's now when the fog comes down from the hills. The hymn still rises some nights, low and patient, carried on the wind like something calling not to be heard, but to be followed. In every year, someone follows, not many, not all at once, just enough that people still whisper about the disappearances. The families tell the police the same thing. Their loved one went for a walk, stepped out in the fog, never came home. But those who know, those who have heard the hymn themselves, don't ask the police to search the chapel. They know what's behind the altar. They know what happens when the iron door opens, because it doesn't close, not for them, not for anyone. And when the fog drifts low across the fields, when the hymn swells, soft and patient through the valley, you can still hear something else beneath. A softer sound layered just beneath the melody, like dozens of voices, low and distant, breathing between each note, not singing, not praying, just waiting. And if you stand too long listening, if you let the sound settle into your chest, you'll notice it, the faint pulse in your own hands, the warmth beneath your skin, like the iron is already there, waiting for you to touch it. And somewhere, far down the hill, faint and patient, a voice moves just beneath the hymn's soft level, unhurried. Come closer. And when you turn, when you finally step away and glance back at the hill, the chapel is gone. Only fog and the sound of a door somewhere in the mist swinging open. Perhaps faith is not what we sing, but what listens when we do, and sometimes it listens back. Perhaps faith is not what we sing, but what listens when we do, and sometimes it listens back.